I'm going to ask my panelists to please take their place on the stage. I think we have a very exciting hour and a half ahead. OCA has been kind enough to give us until 4 o'clock, recognizing the value and importance of this conversation. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I do have to make a little plug and encourage you to visit the CIV DDD booth in the Future of Computing area. It's the Center for Information Visualization and Data-Driven Design. I'm proud to be a co-PI on that project, and it's a lot of fun. You can see the future of computing through very visual and experiential means. So as you know, the world's volume of data is growing at an exponentially faster pace than computing power and our human ability to make sense of that information. This has, of course, led to an emphasis on the development of new analytics and visualization tools aimed at increasing human capacity to interact with data to inform decision-making. We are very pleased to welcome this panel of experts who are truly positioned on the frontiers of advanced research computing, finding answers to some of society's grand challenges. Before we begin, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce you to our panelists, and for their full biographies, I refer you to the Discovery mobile app and website. So our first panelist is Dr. Chris Elias-Smith. Dr. Elias-Smith is the director of the Center for Theoretical Neurosciences, CTN, at the University of Waterloo. We have a drum roll introducing him. Fantastic. He was recently elected as one of only 90 Canadian academics to receive this honor to the new Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists. His book, How to Build a Brain, describes the semantic front pointer architecture for constructing large-scale brain models. His team, which is a very interdisciplinary team, which you're going to hear about, has built what is currently the world's largest functional brain model, SPAWN, and the first to demonstrate realistic behavior under biological constraints. Our second panelist is Andrew Fersman. Andrew is the CEO and co-founder of IQB, Information Technologies, the world's first software company dedicated to producing applications for commercial quantum computers. Andrew studied economics at the University of Waterloo and philosophy and political science at the University of British Columbia prior to completing postgraduate programs in technology studies at Singularity University and financial engineering at Stanford University. And I just have to make a footnote here, which is that both Chris and Andrew have studied philosophy. And for those of you who have heard some of the recent critiques of humanities studies, I just want to underscore many times the word philosophy. We'll move on. Our next panelist is Professor Ben Allary, a professor and associate dean at the Faculty of Law of the University of Toronto. Ben researches and teaches principally in taxation law and judicial decision-making. His publications have appeared in numerous academic journals, and he is co-author of several editions of Canadian income tax law. And I think you'll find it very interesting to hear why he is on this panel. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Michael Brudno. Dr. Brudno is the director of the Center for Computational Medicine at the Hospital for Sick Children and an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto. His main research interest is the development of computational methods for the analysis of genomic data sets, including methods for the discovery of structural and copy number polymorphisms and other genomic variation, identification of functional variants, and visualization of genomic data. His work includes comparative genomics, molecular evolution, and cloud computing. So please put your hands together and welcome this distinguished panel. So we're going to hear from each of the panelists, and then we do have some time for some questions that I'm going to pose for them, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to hear from you. So we're going to start now with Dr. Christopher Eliasmith with his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Very kind of you. I hope this is the right one. So thank you all very much for coming to this. I know there's lots of other things you could be doing at OCE, but the future, right? I mean, it's fun to talk about the future. And this is because pretty much no matter what you say, you're not wrong, yet. But we don't want to just talk about the future. We want to say something interesting about the future. And how do you do that? I think the way that you do that is the way you say something interesting about anything, right? You want some evidence. You want some information. How do we get evidence about the future? We can notice that the future is actually something that's happening all the time, right? Now is the future for lots of different pasts. And especially when you're talking about something like computing, where it's constantly changing and it's influencing our lives, we don't actually have to go that far back in the past to begin to get information about the future. So let's do this, right? Let's go 20 years, kind of a random number, but let's go 20 years back into the past to give us a perspective on computing in 2015. So if we do this, we find ourselves in 1995. What was happening in computing in 1995? Amazon hit the web for the first time. Microsoft, if you might remember, released an operating system named after that year, right? Windows 95. This was like 12 versions of that operating system ago, so it was a long time ago. In the same year, a company released an algorithm called backrub. Does anyone know what this company became known as? 2 years later, this company changed its name to Google. So this is an algorithm which has had huge amounts of impact on computing. In that same year, Garry Kasparov was the chess champion, and IBM began to build for him an opponent that eventually defeated him. Right? It was sort of the first case where a computer really beat a person at an intellectually challenging task. That computer was called Deep Blue. So these are all sort of things that were going on more or less in the software world. But also remember that cell phones look like that. Right? These are big bricks. And don't forget, they're just phones. Right? Not even really good phones. So there you go. That's 1995. 20 years later, we are where we are today. And you can think that like a lot of what we have now is actually pretty unimaginable sitting back in 1995. So cell phones, they're tiny. They're orders of magnitude more powerful than what the desktops of that day were. You can do all kinds of things that you could never have thought of doing with a phone, right? Let alone one that you could carry around with you. And on the software side, we have algorithms that can classify any of 8 million different faces in under 2 seconds. Facebook is using this kind of technology. Google, they can now search enormous amounts of information in microseconds. We can even talk to our phones, and it will search the web for us in a reasonably natural way. These kinds of algorithms, again, were unthinkable back in 1995. And on the hardware side, I haven't actually mentioned one of the main companies that resulted in what was then the future of computing, and that's ARM. In 1995, ARM had just released its first chips and was just becoming commercially successful. And the thing that they had done was basically realize that the future of computing, the computing we know now, really depended on efficiency, energy efficiency. Right? That was the thing that they noticed. If they could target, and they were successful at targeting, they would be able to influence the future of computing. And if you look around now, 98% of cell phones sold have ARM chip designs in them. So when we stand here and we kind of look back, right, it's kind of a bit like cheating, right? We can identify what the important sorts of things were. We can look at the differences in hardware. We can look at the differences in software. But in some way, the really interesting part would be to figure out who then, right, who in 1995 would have been able to predict what happened in the future of computing. And obviously, many people were involved on both the hardware side and the software side. But I think it's undeniable that on the hardware side, one of the people who had a huge influence was this guy named Steve Ferber. He was the architect of those first ARM chips. So even before 1995, he realized that energy efficiency was something that was going to drive computing forwards. Now, energy efficiency is interesting because it's actually not like a lot of other computational properties. We seem to be coming to the end of energy efficiency. We're not making chips which are more efficient. We're kind of hitting a wall. So it's not the case that we can just say, all right, what was good for the past is good for the future, right? We have to think hard about what we really need to focus on over the next 20 years. And I think it's interesting to turn to someone like Steve, who built these chips, these extremely efficient chips, and see, well, what does he think the future of computing is? And he's decided that it's really about architecture. So he's now focusing on what some people like to refer to as neuromorphic computing. So this is building computers that are mimicking some aspect of the brain in order to go forwards. So for Steve, this means taking these chips, which he designed, and then putting them together. Right? Not putting 8 of them together like you find on your desktop. But he's interested in massive parallelism. So this board that I'm showing here has over 1,000 cores on it. And what he wants to do is take many of these boards and put them together in order to scale up to the point where he can run 1 billion neurons. There we get back to the neuromorphic side. You can think of those as cores if you prefer. But 1 billion neurons running in real time. That's what his goal is. And why does he want to do this? Well, he's interested in efficiently running brain-like algorithms. That's why he's building this brain-like hardware. And the idea is to take those kinds of algorithms, that kind of hardware, put it together, and do things like put it on a robot. Right? So you can remember this little guy for later. So I want to say a little bit more about what I mean by brain-like architectures and brain-like algorithms. So let me tell you a couple of brain facts. Right? As probably everybody here knows, the brain is made out of neurons. Right? 80 billion neurons in the average human brain. They're connected by a quadrillion connections. These are extremely large numbers. Your brain controls everything that you think, everything you do, everything you feel. Right now, as you are looking at me and you're hearing me, it's the activity of your brain, all those connections among all those neurons, that is putting together some kind of story, making something coherent, hopefully, out of what I'm saying. And it might influence your behavior later on. So the brain is really far more powerful than the most powerful supercomputers that we have. Nevertheless, it runs on 20 watts of energy. That's less than a light bulb. So when you notice these kinds of things about the brain, people like Steve Ferber and myself and many other people have thought that the brain also probably holds some of the secrets to the future of computing. So it's worth looking at the details of the brain. Right? For Steve Ferber, this means hardware. Looking at the kinds of architectures that you find in the brain, and you notice lots of connections. I mentioned a quadrillion of them. Connections between fairly simple units, right? Individual neurons. And that's how he uses the brain in order to inspire the way that he's developing computers. For me, I'm interested in understanding the kinds of algorithms that the brain is using in order to try to design more intelligent, more effective devices, and also to understand who we are. So this is why I am interested in the brain. So from the hardware side, we can actually look at the brain, right? Look at the structure of the brain. Those smallest elements that I mentioned before, they're called neurons. They look something like this. And on the left-hand side, we essentially have a bunch of input wires. And that big long thing going towards the right is the output. And if you look at how neurons function, they gather a lot of information from those inputs that are called dendrites. If enough input comes such that it goes over a threshold, a spike, a very brief action potential change in voltage is emitted and goes down that axon. And then it goes on to many other neurons. On average, a neuron is connected to 10,000 inputs and has 10,000 outputs. So every time that spike goes down that axon and goes to the dendrites of the next neuron, it's given a weight or an importance, what we call a synaptic strength. So although the same message goes down all those wires, it's kind of interpreted differently by each of the neurons that are receiving that based on that strength. And so when I say something like making brain-like algorithms, I mean figuring out how to set all those connection weights in such a way that something interesting is going to happen. So in fact, the last 15 years of my research has really been focused on this question. How can we specify some function of interest to us and then use mathematical tools that will figure out how to connect up all those neurons together in order to do something interesting? Right? So it's those connections where neural algorithms lie. And the one thing that we've learned, if you do it right, the more neurons you add, the more interesting functions you get. And so we want to start with something simple, right? Start with a single neuron, but then have hundreds or thousands or even millions of neurons working together to do something interesting. And what I'm showing you here, this is the model that Sarah mentioned, which is called SPAN, stands for Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network, which is a mouthful, so I'll just call it SPAN. And it's currently the world's largest functional brain model. It was published in Science a couple of years ago. And you can look at SPAN and you can see that it's doing something, right? It's basically recognizing handwritten digits that it's being shown. It's then processing information in some way and eventually moving its arm to draw out what it thinks it saw. So every time it sees a question mark, that means, what do you think you just saw? And of course, humans can do this exact same task, right? You could do this task. If you did, you get about 98% correct. Some people have very messy handwriting. And the computer, when it does it, has about 94% correct. But the really big difference is that we can actually look inside SPAN's head, right? We can see what all the activity is going on in the visual system. So here I'm showing all those spikes from a whole bunch of neurons moving over time. And from that pattern of activity, we can sometimes deduce what it's looking at, and that's what's written in that thought bubble. But just being able to know what's in front of you isn't enough to solve this task. You actually have to remember that for a while. So here's some frontal cortex, which acts as a memory. So it can remember what it saw. That information can get transferred to motor cortex, which then determines what path it would like to move the arm through. Some more neural processing happens. Then the muscles change. You put tensions in the muscles, and that moves this physically modeled arm in order to draw its answer. But that's actually a fairly easy task, right? It's just classification. Lots of animals can do this kind of task. So we wanted to do something more interesting. We wanted to look at cognitive tasks, right? The kinds of things that people can do. So here is a cognitive task. You can all do this task. And in fact, this test is based on an intelligence test called Raven's progressive matrices. And your job is to figure out what goes in that yellow question mark box at the end when you look at the information that's in those other boxes. And you might look at this and think, yeah, that's pretty easy. But in fact, only humans are any good at this kind of task. So it's clearly cognitive. So here's SPAN doing that same task. And I should note that it's never seen this pattern of digits before. So it's really looking at the pattern, figuring out what's going on, learning from that, and then determining how to answer just like you are, putting an answer in that last box. And if we run the model on many different tests of this kind, then we can show that it does about as well as a human of average intelligence. So hopefully you got the same answer, or would have gotten the same answer if the video kept playing. So just like you, it writes 555 in that last box. So of course, I don't think the future of computing lies in doing these particular tasks, right? Where it lies is in how you do these tasks. And if we're really doing them in a brain-like way, then we should actually expect the model to make the same kinds of mistakes that people do. So this is a task where SPAN is remembering a list of digits, just like you would remember a telephone number. And you'll notice that for some of this information, it actually begins to lose the information, right? It begins to forget. I'm not sure why the videos are running that slowly. But you can see that 8 is beginning to fade away, right? It's losing that information. And so if it completed the task, you would see it write out the first 3 digits, 0, 1, 5. When it gets to the 8, it doesn't know what's there, so it draws a line, indicating that it doesn't know what's going on. And then it completes it. And if you run SPAN over many lists of many different sorts of lengths, and you average all those results, you can show that it is statistically indistinguishable from people doing the same task. So just like you, SPAN remembers the beginning and the ends of the list better than the middle. So SPAN makes human-like mistakes. It takes human-like lengths of time to process information. and it also generates human-like brain activity. And I should note that Spawn does all of these tasks with exactly the same brain, right? The model doesn't change in any way. And it can do other tasks. It can add, it can count, it can copy the style of digits that you show it. And so it's really able to replicate the flexibility of cognition, because it can do many different tasks and figure out how to switch between those tasks. So what Spawn has really done for us is begin to give us a sense of what kinds of algorithms, although it's much simpler than a brain, right, what kinds of algorithms do we think are useful for understanding the future of computing? Right, so you get the point. Spawn basically acts like a brain. And this is why I think it represents the future of computing. And I'm not the only one. In fact, the European Union has, and the United States have both spent over $100 million each on these kinds of models, and they've earmarked billions of dollars more in order to try to build sophisticated, large-scale brain models. So, it makes me pretty proud that Canada, which has spent, shall we say, less than $1 million, is currently leading the race for building these large-scale brain models. And for this reason, Steve Ferber has actually identified as a major research goal of his lab to get Spawn running on his neuromorphic computer. And this is actually something that we expect to have done by the end of the year. And it's really this marriage, right, between the hardware and the software, which I think is going to drive computing forward. Because something I didn't tell you about Spawn is it takes 2.5 hours to generate 1 second of those videos I was showing. When you put it on neuromorphic computers, it will be running in real time. So that's a huge improvement. But you also might think, well, hasn't this kind of thing already been done, right? What about the Google Brain and Siri and Watson and all these sorts of things? And I think the short answer is that they are just not brain-like. And so very quickly you can see ways in which you can use this brain-like model that you can't use those sorts of models. So one thing you can do is you can actually understand how the real brain works. So in this video, if it runs all the way through, what I'm showing is the regular Spawn in the background, and in the front is actually an augmented Spawn, which has some neurons taken out that have been modeled in exquisite detail, where we put lots and lots of biological information in. And what that lets us do is actually apply drugs effectively to this model. So now we can put a drug called TTX, which is a sodium channel blocker, and see what the effect is on the behavior. And you can see what happened there is the model in the front couldn't complete that task anymore. So although this is preliminary, what it's showing is that we can model all the way from the molecular up to behavior and look at all of the kinds of neural mechanisms participating in behavior. And so this is important for understanding the things like the effects of drugs, right, and how they work. And similarly, we've built models where we've essentially given it brain damage, right? So simulated the effects of stroke, and that lets us figure out what interventions work and which interventions don't. So as you can imagine, we think that this can really help us better understand a lot of clinical neuroscience. The other way that I think these kinds of models are clearly different is that they focus on dynamics. So what do I mean by that? Well, these models run in a biological time scale. Right? They're modeled after the physics of the brain, and so they run at the same kinds of speed that the brain runs. And if you think about it for a minute, a lot of our most sophisticated behavior is really dynamic behavior. Right? So if you're playing a sport, you're trying to track a target of some kind, you're trying to figure out what the other players are doing, right? You're trying to figure out what the rest of your team is doing so you can coordinate with them. All of this is happening on extremely short time scales. Or even something sort of more cognitive, like having a conversation, where you take turns with somebody. You have to build on another person's ideas. You have to track context and how the context changes. And you might even be making fairly sophisticated social decisions about who's your friend and who's not so much of a friend. If you take a model like the Google Brain or Siri and you put it in a body, right, nothing would happen because they don't have the dynamics to replicate those sorts of behaviors. If you take a model like Spawn, then you actually get dynamic responses to a changing environment. And here's a simple example. I told you to remember this robot from before. And what it's doing is it's basically trying to keep that hand a certain distance away from it and keep it in front of it. So this is obviously very simple. This is something we actually did about 2 years ago. But nevertheless, it's taking in visual information. It's dynamically processing that information. It's making decisions about how to move. The environment is changing. And it's doing all of this in a robust way. So this is an example, actually one of the first examples, where our algorithms, our neural algorithms, are actually running on Steve Ferber's neural hardware in order to solve a dynamic problem of this kind. And these kinds of dynamics, I think, pave the way for doing very exciting things, especially in robotics. And in the years since then, we've built much more interesting models controlling 6 degree of freedom arms, planning paths, and flying quadcopters. So that kind of summarizes the way that I see the future of computing. Right? And because there were so many different applications floating around, we thought it would be a good idea to start a company, which we did. This is called Applied Brain Research, or ABR. And I should mention that this is another spin-off from Waterloo. And I have to say that they've completely lived up to their reputation for supporting innovation. And the purpose of this company really is to pursue this vision of the future of computing. So we're working on more neural algorithms, more sophisticated algorithms. Because there aren't really big neuromorphic computers around, a lot of what we do is test on standard hardware, so we can compile these to CPUs or GPUs. And one thing that we did just last week, we got Spawn running on the SOSIP supercomputer. Right? So that was very exciting for us, because now we've got this running on a platform which is going to allow a kind of scalability which was just not available to us before. So we can really push these algorithms ahead. We've also been working on the hardware side. So I've mentioned Steve Ferber several times. We're working with a group at Stanford. And they've built a computer that's called NeuroGrid. And what's special about this neuromorphic computer is it actually uses analog computation. So it has the possibility of getting past that energy efficiency wall I talked about before, while still performing very sophisticated computations. And as we were working on these sorts of aspects of computing, we thought, it's good. One thing to give away your models, so you can go and download Spawn, and you can play with it if you have a big enough computer, and so on. But we thought what's really of value here is actually the methods that we're using to build Spawn. And so what I'm showing running in a video here is essentially a development environment that we call Nengo, where you can construct these kinds of models. And so I'm showing something that's actually a fairly sophisticated model. This is a nonlinear dynamical system. It's a frequency-controlled oscillator. It's still state-of-the-art right now. And what it's showing is that in Nengo, you can essentially describe a fairly high-level function. And Nengo acts like a compiler to figure out all the connections between a whole bunch of spiking neurons in order to make that function happen. Now, of course, you might also want to use. You said I could go over time.
1 more minute.
1 more minute's good, actually. I'll stick to that. So, so in addition to our methods that I mentioned, also things like deep learning are critical, so the things that are used to build the Google Brain, right? Reinforcement learning that DeepMind is used. And in fact, Spawn uses all of these things, and we built Spawn with Nengo. And so what we thought is that we shouldn't be the only ones having fun with this sort of thing, so we've given it away. People doing research at universities, or makers, hobbyists, right? The people who often drive the future of computing, it's freely available to them. So I want to conclude, I promise, with this slide, which is basically doing what we did for 1995 as if we were 20 years in the future. Right? So let's go 20 years in the future and say, what would we say about computing in 2015? So we'd see Microsoft still around, I'm quite certain, right, with things like Cortana. So they were a behemoth in 95, a behemoth in 2015. They will still be around 20 years from now. And the same is true of IBM, right, with their very exciting developments in Watson and other kinds of neuromorphic computers that they're working on. And of course, in 1995, there were these little tiny companies no one had ever heard of that are now behemoths, right, like Google. And they have focused on AI and robotics, and I'm sure they will be around in 20 years. And I think the same can be said for Amazon, right, with their focus on cloud computing and robotics. And of course, there's probably going to be some companies which weren't around in 1995, which were just getting started in 2015 maybe. And who knows, 20 years, they might be at the center of it all. Right? Dare to dream, why not? Throw that up there. So with that, I'll invite everybody, if you'd like to come to our booth, please come and take a look. And we've got a live demonstration of our neural algorithms running on Steve Ferber's neuromorphic computer, actually driving a robot around. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think a really great keynote presentation to kick us off. And Andrew Fersman is to follow, and I think you'll see some really nice dynamics between both of these presentations. Andrew.
Thank you very much. I'm on, good. So I'm going to talk very briefly about 1QBit, the company that I've co-founded, but I'm going to try and push through that and talk a little bit more about quantum computers, what they are today, where we think they're going, and why that's interesting. So 1QBit is a company that I co-founded that's really focused on applying quantum computers. So we're not building the hardware itself. We're looking at the hardware that other people are building and trying to think about what you can do with it that's interesting, why it's important that people are building these machines. We think it's important to note that Canada is really one of the really leading places for quantum technologies, and you're probably all familiar with the great work that's happening in Waterloo and Toronto. It's nice for me to also be able to plug the fact that on the West Coast out in Vancouver, there's some great work happening right now to advance the state-of-the-art of quantum technologies. Our company is founded in 2012. We're a team of about 30 people, and we're working with some fairly large industrial partners in order to explore practical applications of this technology in areas like finance, in drug discovery, things that are life sciences, and as well as energy sectors. And we're doing this with a fairly interesting group of research partners. The main commercialized hardware producer you may have heard of, D-Wave. They've been somewhat controversial for the claims that they've been making about building quantum hardware, and a large number of very exciting research partners that are testing out what they're doing with their platform. We're one of them. The reason we're so excited about quantum computation is we think that this is really that spark time. This is the point when, years ago, a few years ago, there was nothing. In the future, we see a very rich ecosystem, and we think this is that moment that really tips it over the top. You can see some great work going on at Google, where they're putting very large amounts of money to work pursuing this, as well as in D-Wave and in the general press. This is starting to become something that's gone from science fiction to a real belief that this is coming and that it's arrived. So what I want to do with the remaining time that I have is talk a little bit about quantum computers, what they are, and why they matter. And I'll start a little bit with what quantum computers are and really what they are to me. I think about quantum computers as being the evolution of the classical computer, where the classical computer took advantage of what we know from classical mechanics, the classical world, and tried to build a computer out of that. So we're talking about the Newtonian world that has gears and pulleys and levers. If you think about a classical computing device, really it kind of goes all the way back to like Babbage's difference engine, these electromechanical machines that were storing zeros and ones as bits of information that are really just these physical things that are in one state or another. And what the quantum computer is to me is saying we now know that we don't live in a classical world. The real world has these quantum features, and we want to be able to take advantage of some of those quantum features in order to build better computers. So what we've known for over 20 years now, really starting with Richard Feynman in 1982, is that if you can build some of these computers that take advantage of the quantum world, then you can build a faster computer. Of course, you need to do this at scale before it makes any sense, but it's been hypothesized all the way back in the early 80s. It was also David Deutsch really first coined the term quantum computers, that if you can build a system that leverages the quantum world, you can do some tasks much faster than a classical computer will ever be able to do them. And that's what's excited us and motivated our research. So the first commercial producer of quantum hardware is a company called D-Wave, based out of Vancouver, British Columbia. And they're on record as saying that their next generation of machine is going to be the first one that's really interesting from a sort of competitive perspective. And by that, they don't mean this is going to be a machine that's going to get you to throw away all your classical computers, but they think that this is going to be the first time when they can really demonstrate some interesting commercial applications for this technology, and to be able to demonstrate that if they can continue scaling, then they'll be on an interesting curve that really powers the software that you can develop for these machines. But the quantum computer itself, although this is what you may have seen, is actually really just, that's the big shielding for what is in effect a giant Schrodinger's box. The classical idea of the cat that's dead and alive. If you're not familiar with it, it's a fun and depressing Google thought experiment. But inside that box, there's actually a refrigerator. The shielding itself takes all the electromagnetic radiation and takes it away. So you basically have an electromagnetic vacuum inside. The refrigerator is designed to take the temperature of the very bottom portion of that, looks like a Dr. No laser in there. That very bottom is hovering just above absolute zero. And within that rarefied environment of no magnetic interference and no temperature, or very low of both, you have your quantum chip. And the quantum chip itself looks actually like a regular chip. But because of the fact that it's in this strange environment, it's able to take advantage of some of the quantum effects that are not available to us in the day-to-day world. Those effects include superposition, entanglement, and the interesting things that come from observing quantum systems. So if you think about it, inside that chip, inside the box, there's the chip, and inside that chip, you can see it kind of looks like a grid of little tiny squares in there. Each of those squares is actually a unit cell of qubits, which are the quantum bits themselves. And so you can see it looks like a bunch of rings laid over top of each other. Each one of those rings is actually a qubit, and the reason that it requires a strange environment is because you can actually run current through that wire. It's, in this case, niobium, but you can also use aluminum. By running the current both clockwise and counterclockwise, which is only possible with a superconductor, you can actually make a magnet that's simultaneously north up and north down. Basically, it's a superposition of magnetic information, which allows you to basically have a bit that's simultaneously in the on and off position. And that's the real magic of quantum computers and the power of where this comes from. If you take that diagram and try and reduce it down to something that's a little bit more stylized, you can see you basically end up with a connectivity of points connected to each other, and that image on the far right-hand side of the screen, this actually shows the points and connections of the architecture that's inside one of these chips. That's the whole chip sort of stylized together. And what we do when we build software for these systems is to take something that's a well-known traditional method of doing computation. So for example, this is a particular form of machine learning, and we actually embed this process into the chip that's in there. So our company, 1QBit, is really about trying to take these real-world applications and to put them onto this new architecture. We can do some interesting things, specifically with graphs. We look a lot at things like drug discovery using graph comparison, so being able to compare graphs to each other using this comparison technique. We can do some interesting drug analysis, which is a very difficult problem for classical computers. In fact, every time you add one additional molecule to a drug, it becomes twice as complex and twice as difficult for a classical machine to be able to compare. So if you want to be able to show why heroin and codeine are like morphine and methadone isn't, this is actually a fairly difficult computational challenge, and it only gets more difficult as you scale up. In fact, it's so difficult that doing this exhaustively is something that even with the world's largest supercomputers is just not possible. We also extend that into areas like financial market analysis. And the really critical thing to think about is that these qubits are like little quantum switches, and they work in that superposition like I was saying. So if you want to have an example of why this is so powerful, if you think about at the beginning of movies when people sort of have the little clapboard that comes together, you sometimes see someone holding a light meter. And you can imagine that's because they know exactly the lighting that they would like to have within their shot. If you have 10 light switches, then that gives you 2 to the 10 possible ways that you can light the room in order to reach that optimal lighting. But if you go to 2 to the 20, you end up with about 1 million possible ways to do it. 2 to the 30 gets you to about 1 billion. But a room like this, you've got more than a couple hundred lights in here. With only 250 light switches, you've actually got more possible ways to light a room than there are atoms in the observable universe. And so to exhaustively search through that entire space is very, very difficult. Whereas if you can describe the way that you would like the lighting and be able to feed that into a quantum computer, What it does is basically passes you back the lighting positions for each of them. This is really just an extension of what we're seeing with traditional computing. We've seen this before where we've come to the end of a paradigm. But the difference is all of these previous paradigms have relied on the bit. This is the first time that we transitioned to the qubit. So although this was an evolution, it was a radical evolution, going from a classical machine to a quantum machine is really the first, or evolution, sorry. This is the first real revolution in computation. And although we are just sort of at the spark point right now, where it's the very beginning of working with this technology and the very beginning of producing this stuff commercially, we think that that spark is going to very, very quickly accelerate. So we're one qubit. You can take a look at us online. We're interested in working with a number of different organizations facing really tough combinatorial optimization problems, and we're really working to be able to get the idea of how quantum computers work out to a larger audience. So I'm happy to have conversations with anyone else who's interested in learning more about this, and I'll be around after the show. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. We're going to move into some very, very exciting applications now, and I'd like Ben Ilari to come up and share his work with us.
Thank you, Sarah. So in the introduction, Sarah posed a rhetorical question to the audience. Many of you were here, many of you weren't. But the rhetorical question was, why is a law professor, speaking on a panel about the future of computing? It's actually a very good question. It was a question that I was asking myself as I read my email and I had an invitation to speak on this very panel. And then I thought about it. The real reason that I'm speaking on this panel is because I'm a bridge builder. And you might wonder, well, Ben, you just finished saying you're a law professor and a legal academic. Where's this bridge builder business coming from? Well, it comes from the fact that we're actually bridging a lot of the future of computing on the hardware side, the models that Chris has described, Andrew's described with the quantum computer. We're actually engaged in building a bridge between the law and the future of computing. The future of computing is going to be applied, and the applications is going to draw out a lot of the improvements in the future of computing. And so that's what I'll speak to you a little bit about. How did I get involved in this? Credit goes to the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto and IBM jointly. IBM hosted a Watson Challenge, and the University of Toronto was the Canadian university involved in the Watson Challenge. It culminated in a competition in New York in January. I was a panelist at the internal U of T competition, and as I said, as a panelist, I was really thinking about tax law and judicial decision making. And these are things that I'm very interested in as an academic. And none of the teams was pitching a tax law project. And I thought, wow, this is an amazing opportunity to use Watson's power to make sense of the law. And so without describing what the project is, I'm actually going to invite the AV guys to show you a video about what Blue Jay Legal is all about.
Blue Jay Legal, making professionals better. The hardest thing in the world to understand is the income tax. Albert Einstein. Tax law is complex. It's become so complex that professionals cannot digest it in its entirety, and this leads to a struggle to provide confident legal opinions. Compliance with tax law is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and cost-effective, accurate legal advice is in high demand. This is where Blue Jay comes in. Blue Jay thinks like a lawyer. Blue Jay is powered by IBM's Watson, and Blue Jay has been created and designed by 3 law professors at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. Professor Benjamin Allery, Professor Anthony Niblett, and Professor Albert Yoon. We said that Blue Jay thinks like a lawyer. That means that Blue Jay is designed to understand the facts of cases, to understand the law, and to come up with quick, accurate legal answers. Let's illustrate with an example. The example we've chosen is the following question. Is a worker an employee Or is that worker an independent contractor? This is an important question in many areas of law, from tax to corporate law to employment law to contracts and tort law. Here's how our prototype works. We ask IBM's Watson a question containing the facts relevant to a tax issue. We take these facts and we feed them into Watson. Watson then reads all the relevant law, all the relevant cases, all the relevant statutes. It provides a legal answer. It tells us the closest cases and tells us what the result in those cases was. In this case, an independent contractor. Based on this evidence, we can provide legal advice. We provide an answer to the legal question. BlueJ can also answer other complicated questions in tax law, and going forward, BlueJ Legal will extend beyond tax law to other areas of law. There are indeed boundless opportunities. The BlueJ Legal team is devoting significant time and energy to pursue an aggressive development timeline. And the BlueJ Legal team is backed and supported by a talented and experienced advisory board. BlueJ Legal, making professionals better.
So, thank you. This has consumed hundreds of hours already in building this simple prototype and answering this question, how to characterize individuals as employees or independent contractors. And there are a number of complications as bridge builders, as construction workers that we've encountered in this process. And a number of them are endemic to the law. So the law is interdisciplinary. Legal academics like Anthony and Albert and I think about law as having a number of different dimensions, right? So law is, by and large, behavioral, and the behavior that law addresses is individual. Individual decisions are made about whether to comply with law or not to comply with law, and that's kind of the domain of psychology. When the law implicates multiple parties, as N moves from one to many, law becomes very related to politics, right? So political developments actually generate law. And so law and politics is something that many of our colleagues are engaged in at the law school. But law is also normative. So Sarah mentioned philosophy at the start of the session. And of course, law is deeply normative. And so my colleagues who engage in legal theory, law and philosophy, think about the normativity of law in different ways. Some are Kantians, so they spend all their time thinking about Immanuel Kant. Others are Aristotelian, so they think about Aristotle and corrective justice and such things. Many of us on the faculty, though, are consequentialists, so we actually care about the results that law generates in the world. And BlueJ Legal is really a byproduct of that consequentialist approach to thinking about the law, and that's why we're the right people to be engaged in this project. Of course, the real world is messy. There are lots of challenges in overcoming this, actually building this bridge. One is, and you heard my co-founder Anthony Niblett's voice in the video. That was Anthony's voice. He's English and Australian. If you were struggling to place Anthony's accent, that was quite right to be struggling with that. It's a bit of a hybrid. I lost my train. Anthony is just in my mind. What was I saying? Right. Right. So the challenge is that all the case law that Anthony was talking about is highly selected. So parties to litigation actually decide whether or not they want a judge to decide the case. So there's selection bias that goes into the observations that we end up feeding into Watson, into the corpus that Watson decides on. It's highly curated by the parties. And so it's based on, in that indeterminate range of cases that only appear. So the raw material, of course, are the words of the judgments of the cases. And the words are there's a lot of selection bias. So what happens is, if we're training Watson only with these highly curated cases, we're only operating in that gray zone. So what we discovered in the course of training our prototype is we had to include additional cases that are clear on either end. So we had to fill out the space of cases by going at each pool. Cases that are clearly employees, cases that are clearly independent contractors. Focusing only on that indeterminate gray area wasn't enough to get the training off the ground. There are additional complications. So there's the selection bias. Of course, we're not going to replace lawyers. Lawyers are necessary. Judges are necessary. And one of the very important reasons is that facts need to be determined at trial. So judges are called triers of fact in the legal system. They actually determine what evidence is admissible to court, how that evidence is actually sifted through, analyzed, and the judge actually finds the facts and says that X, Y, and Z actually happen. And so we can ask questions about, well, are you an employee if X, Y, and Z actually obtain, but the decision about whether that actually obtains is a question of fact. What actually happened in the real world? And that only a judge can decide with the help of counsel who are well-versed in evidence law. And so we can't replace that. We can only posit that the conclusion should be employee or independent contractor in this case for a certain set of facts. And of course, things vary. So judges exhibit different patterns of decision making. Albert and Nancy and I have spent much of our careers analyzing the idiosyncratic variations in judges' behavior on the bench and the way that they reach decisions. So judges vary in their policy preferences and how they think about legal questions. And counsel vary in ability, right? So depending on the quality of your representative before the court, you may have a stronger or weaker chance against the opposing counsel and whoever the opposing counsel actually is. So there are lots of complications. What we can use Watson to do, though, is provide a preliminary answer and an assessment of whether you're likely to be an independent contractor or an employee. If even this concrete example seems a little bit too still abstract, I invite you to go to the Blue Jay Legal exhibit, which is at the corner of the Young Entrepreneur Zone, just over this way. And we have two terminals that you can actually type in facts. It'll elicit some information from you, and you can find out the probability according to every single case decided on this question in Canadian tax law, whether your worker is likely to be an employee or an independent contractor. So I invite you to do that this afternoon if you have an interest in trying out Watson. And it's actually going to connect directly to IBM's Watson through the cloud. Ping your question to Watson, and Watson will give you a percentage confidence about the characterization. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Truth or consequence? Very interesting. And now Michael is going to share some thoughts about genomics.
Thanks. So first of all, thanks for having me. And it's ironic that most of the panelists today are humanities graduates. I actually did my undergrad in history. But today I want to talk about organizing big medical data, which has little to do with history and more about the future. So this is actually a story of a research project in my group. We're studying genomics, wanted to know what's the genetic variance, what's the mutation that causes a disease. And we talked to doctors and said, sure, we can give you data. And we had the patient's genomes, and then we wanted to find out what actually disease the patient had. And it turned out that getting information what disease a patient has from an electronic health record is like that slide, where clinicians tell you, we're collecting lots and lots of data, and in reality, the data is in a broom closet, and it's impossible to get at, impossible to process, and impossible to understand. And you may say, oh, okay, well, you have text records, you can do some kind of mining. It turns out it's difficult. If you use standardized data, most of that's billing codes, and those are very commonly misused. This is what doctors use to figure out how much to bill an insurance company. And if you can put A or B in your logbook, and A gets you more money, guess what? A is going to be the entry in the ICD code, the billing code that the doctor is using. And if you want to mine the free text notes, it's really messy. It's inaccurate. You know, if you look at something as simple as, does a patient have dementia, you will see 70% accuracy at determining something like this, because dementia can be described in many ways in the textual record, as I'll show. And finally, the big issue is HRs are used to record data and not to read data back. They're a historic record of what was done, much more so than a guide to help improve clinical care, a guide to help improve how a doctor actually treats their patient. So when, for example, you look at how a doctor may describe what a patient looks like, they may use free text or checkboxes. And for a single thing, like a patient presenting with dysmorphic features, which are non-standard face morphology, you may see any of these. DF, dysmorphic, dysmorphic faces, dysmorphic features, they mean the exact same thing. And for something like congenital malformations, all of these texts have actually come up in sick kids' medical records. These include things like multiple congenital abnormalities, because people don't know how to type, or anomaly, which is spelled A-O in the wrong way, because people don't know how to spell. And that's not fine. We're humans. We're not required to do that. And the alternative is to use checkboxes where you can go and check what specific thing the patient has, but really there's a huge span of things to look at. You can only put limited granularity, you put large-scale systems, you don't really get the detail that you want from this. And there's always, on all of these checkboxes, I'm sure you've seen lots of forms like this that your doctor has filled out before, there's always the other box where you're back to all the free text problems. So we looked at this and we said, well, this was about 3.5, 4 years ago, and it's like, there should be a better way of actually doing this. And it turned out there were ways of organizing medical data that could help. But in addition, so the problems that we encountered, phrases like first words at 5 years. You know what that means as a human. That probably means the child has a language delay. That's not something that's obvious to a computer. And that's not something that text mining techniques or even things with lots of contextual information can understand easily. Or a phrase like recognizes only close relatives, which is something that you may see which describes dementia. One of the issues with these is you couldn't define distances between phenotypes. If you see a phrase and it says, you don't know if a broken bone is any more similar to epileptic seizures as it is to a broken, a broken cartilage, because those are, these terms are not very well defined. So really what we thought should be the goal of an electronic health record is a system that helps a clinician navigate between symptoms, phenotypes, tests, and the genome. Can help integrate data from across all of these domains and bring them together to help improve what a clinician actually does, very similar to what was shown in the case of illegal. The goal is not to replace the doctor, the goal is to help the doctor navigate a huge amount of information, not just what's in the medical textbook, but even the thick binder that's following your patient from room A to room B, where you don't know what test was done 3 weeks ago because that's 100 pages ago in your binder, so you'd have to flip through all those 100 to figure it all out. We're using something called the human phenotype ontology, which is a structure of human phenotypes, human presentations, which are organized by various systems, eye diseases, neurologic, skeletal, and so on. And it has a large number of terms. And actually, interestingly, as I was studying the human phenotype ontology to figure out if it works for my cases, I figured out it was great for my graduate students. So I don't know if you can see this, but it has things like irritability, lack of motivation, lack of insight, adherence to routine, and restlessness and shyness. So this is basically your computer science graduate student all on one page. And they also tend to run around in circle, which is apparently called a postdoc phenotype. So we built a system that was able to actually capture data which was standardized, but allowed the clinician to use free text by using things like searching of the ontology live, real time, as the clinician is typing the information, by using things like autocorrection of the terms, by using suggestion of spelling mistakes, so even if you misspelled the term, it will still appear, by adding carrots for a clinician to use the system, by figuring out what is it in their lives that they hate the most. And it turned out that those things had nothing to do with medicine. They hated the most drawing growth charts, which is, these little plots where you have to put how tall a kid is based on their age and figure out whether this is abnormal or normal. A computer can do that better than the doctor can, and you don't need a medical degree. So doing these things have actually built a system that clinicians really wanted to use. We've added things. When you do have the textual record, we do want to mine it and give you suggestions based on it. Just because we interpret something as being present in your record, we don't assume it's true. We present it to the clinician and allow them to actually select it as being present. And because we're not actually going to build a whole electronic medical record from scratch, this is a huge undertaking, billion-dollar products, we actually are taking our system, which is called Phenotypes, and building it on top of existing medical records, using existing APIs to allow a clinician to use our system to enter the data, but then have all the data saved within an electronic health record that's being able to be parsed and used appropriately. So how far have we gone? So 4 years ago we started. This was something that was a side project for one postdoctoral fellow in my research group. Today, it's something that's deployed in 5 hospitals for all of their genetic disease cases. It's used by the NIH Undiagnosed Diseases Program in the US, by hospitals in the UK, Australia, Europe, here in Toronto. It's supporting a large number of research projects. It's a development effort which has 10 full-time employees in my research group. And because we needed to provide support, we have now actually created a company which is helping users work with the software. While the software itself remains open source to the academic community and freely available. So with all of that, I just want to re-emphasize the importance of standardization of health data. So I'm a computer scientist. When I saw how health data is organized, to me that was, didn't we figure all of this out 40 years ago before I was ever born? And it turned out, no. In health, there was a lot of issues that have come up that forced people to make decisions about data organization, which I think is going to be suboptimal and did not really lead to the ability to easily compute on the data. By having good, strong standards, well-organized medical ontologies, you can allow for integration of data between studies, identification of unrelated patients. So one of the things our system does is it tells you, oh, you've seen a similar patient before. You may not remember it, but here's a case record that's very similar to the patient that you're seeing right now. It can allow you to actually analyze the genome. And this is where we started, because the genome is a lot of data that doctors didn't know how to analyze. And by actually putting suggestions about here are the most interesting mutations into the system, we've actually gotten the clinicians to use the system. We allow for phenotype the patient at the bedside. So basically, a lot of the doctors now are taking their laptop to the patient and are doing all the data entry there, not just retroactively looking at their notes and typing it in. And this has really been, I think, useful for training the next generation of clinicians. The younger doctors are one of the quickest to adopt a system like this. They see the advantage of being able to rely on their older colleagues' experience, on being able to see, oh, a case like that went through already, and this is what was done. Here is what an experienced colleague's clinical acumen sort of suggested. So it's, in that way, it has really been very successful. So with that, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. 4 absolutely fantastic presentations. Oh my goodness, and who was the other one? Okay, we're going to start with some questions, and I thought it would be great to start with an OCE appropriate question, which is really about the actions that they've taken in order to be able to take their research into the application space and to commercialize it, either working with companies such as IBM or creating their own companies, and the kinds of support services that they've taken advantage of, and where the strengths and where some of the weaknesses or gaps are. So we're going to start, we're going to kind of go backwards, I think, from where we began. So Michael, I'm going to start with you. You just talked about creating a company, and tell us a little bit about that experience and what some of the challenges and positives have been.
So I guess from my experience in starting a company, I come from an academic background. I have no experience starting companies. This is not something we do. We write papers and we write grants. And actually, the company that we've started is a open source support company, which is quite a bit different than some of the other ones. And it's been a very steep learning curve for me in terms of figuring out, how do I get an employment contract set up from the very basics to, how do I write a business case, which is again something very different. I've not actually worked with the OC, although we're right now applying for Smart Start. And
so did you work with Mars at all, or Mars Innovation, or no?
Actually,
okay.
no.
So you're new. So
we're
okay.
new.
Well, OCE, here you go. You can reach out afterwards and make sure that happens. Andrew, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience? It's really in the commercial space, but what mechanisms have helped you?
Yeah, for sure. We had the opportunity to actually come out. Although started originally in Vancouver, we were part of the 111 incubator, which is supported by OCE. So that's been a great footprint in Toronto for us. We've also taken advantage of a number of other programs that are offered around here. Specifically, MyTax has allowed us to take a lot of people. This is a very new technology that we're working with, and there's not groups of people who already have this skill set. We're really kind of developing this skill set. And so instead of trying to go and find people who are adept at writing code for quantum computers, we went and found smart people graduating from programs, PhDs and postdocs in abstract mathematics and high energy physics and things like that. And we're able to engage with them through MyTax specifically in order to be able to create a team of now around 30 people who are really trying to push this field forward by doing the research and the learning and commercializing all together as teams.
And Ben, your experience is somewhat different. You're working with IBM. How have you made that successful between a law professorship and a large company?
Right. So far, the project has been an academic project, and so we've been able to secure our own academic instance of Watson that we've been accessing since January. One joke that I meant to tell during my remarks is that I'm chair of the admissions process at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and Watson is by far the most promising 6-year-old law student we've ever had at the law school. So we've been training Watson for the last several months. Watson is really, really promising. Unlike most law students, Watson is going to get exponentially better with age. Most law students actually trail off a little bit in ability year by year. My empirical analysis actually shows as you get older, you actually drop like about 1 percentile in your class rank at the law school. But setting that aside, it's been really great working with IBM on this, and they've generously made this academic instance available to us. As we move forward, we're going to transition into IBM's Watson ecosystem and get into the commercializing stream with Watson. So
do you imagine a suite of products within IBM, or do you imagine some kind of set of services or products that would be spun out of the law faculty?
Right. So our intention is to incorporate Blue Jay Legal and have Blue Jay Legal as a U of T startup company.
Okay, Chris, over to you. You've got a lot of experience both on the basic research side, but also in commercial collaborations and with your own company. How has that gone, and what support systems have you used?
Well, actually, I've been very lucky to have run into somebody who has a lot of business experience and has been instrumental in guiding the company through the entire, at least half of things that we have to do that I'm not familiar with. So in a sense, we haven't had to rely on some of the kinds of programs that are around. We've been lucky enough to get some funding from OCE that lets us pursue both the research and the exponential growth that we're looking at in order to demonstrate the abilities of the technology. But I think really the sort of biggest challenge has essentially been an educational one. Educational in the sense of trying to be clear about what new things we can do with our methods. So AI is one of those things that gets a lot of press. That's both a blessing and a curse. On the blessing side, it makes people sort of intrinsically interested or sometimes scared of the technology. But on the Curse side, we have to figure out ways of explaining succinctly and clearly exactly what it is that we're doing, and that is not always an easy thing to do because it is a very technical area, right? So just, I think this would probably be called messaging, right? Figuring out the right way, the succinct way to get across to people what we're doing, exactly how it's different and so on, is a huge challenge in an area like that.
That's a really great segue actually into my next question. And Michael, you mentioned, I was really struck that you commented that younger doctors were curious and open to this technology, but potentially we're looking at really significant disruptions, transformations in terms of healthcare. So what are you encountering in terms of either resistance or interest as you're developing these capacities?
So I think, both lots of interest and lots of resistance from sometimes the same people. We have had, the resistance has come from questions as much as, do I need to scrub my computer every single time I go into an exam room? And obviously that's not practical. And the answer to that is usually, do you scrub your pencil every time you go into an exam room? And the answer is typically no. But the clinicians are very keen to see the power of the technology. They're keen to be able to use a computer to help their practice. They're very interested in this typically. And as soon as they can see that it actually helps their practice, it helps them achieve quicker and better diagnosis, they're adapted really quickly. The hesitation can come as things as simple as we say, well, the website, the software is available through a website. The website is local. You don't actually go anywhere over the cloud. Your patient health data never leaves your hospital. But there is just the fact that you open the browser window already makes clinicians nervous. And there's a lot of education that needs to happen. That's like, no, just because you open the browser doesn't mean your data is leaking to Google or to any other company. I didn't want to pick on one.
So Ben, similar question to you. You're working with lawyers. You specialize in, I guess, an approach to law, which is consequential. I thought that was, important to underscore very different approaches within the law. Are you finding resistance among some law firms and colleagues? And then who is interested?
Right. So one of the interesting things is a regular reaction by lawyers to the kind of project that we're pursuing with Blue Jay Legal. And I even saw it yesterday. I saw an old classmate of mine from the law school, and he came over and said, "Hey Ben, how's it going?" And, it's going really well. And so I described the project. He said, "Oh, that's really interesting. Of course, it would never work in my practice area, but it would work for lots of other practice areas." And he began to prattle off how it would work for other lawyers in other practice areas. But that's actually totally consistent with what I encounter with lots of lawyers as I talk to them. Well, of course that would never apply to my transfer pricing practice, but I could totally see why that would work for the shred practice of some of my colleagues in the tax group. And so it's interesting. Everyone seems to have a blind spot with that, which they're most intimately familiar themselves professionally. They think there's some kind of irreducible complication there that means that something like Blue Jay would never be able to penetrate that complexity, but of course they can see the utility for every other area of law, which I personally find very interesting, and I hope that they're not all right about their own areas of law.
That's great. Andrew, you gave 3 really great examples. You talked about graphs, drug analytics, and what I would describe as building control systems to some extent. So you're working with a fundamental technology that you're trying to bring into these very different applications and cultures. What are you encountering as you do that? What kind of interest, what kind of, barriers as well?
The nice thing for us is because it is such a fundamental technology, my goal with using the light switch example earlier on is because it's just really fundamentally looking at that problem, that one problem that people think of as combinatorial optimization. There's a lot of things built on top of that. So if you go and talk to an oil company, they might think that what they're really doing is just routing oil through pipes. But when you get down and talk to the practitioners, they understand at some level that the challenges come from that very specific technical problem. And so Our problem, or I guess our challenge, is always to try and find the people who are the technical people within each organization who understand the abstract mathematical problem that they're wrestling with and be able to connect that to our researchers so that our research seems applicable to the larger organization. And I think that really just comes from having the conversation at the right levels, where probably having me go and talk to another CEO would not yield the same great results for that organization as having one of our researchers talk to one of their practitioners.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, you showed some great pictorial representations. I'm curious, you're representing huge volumes of data. I have to ask, as a visualization person, what role do you see for visualization? And what are some of the challenges in actually designing visualizations to represent that level of complexity?
Right. So I guess clearly one of the challenges is having PowerPoint play the entire movie, which was not a challenge I experienced on my own machine. But I mean, this is a good question. I mean, for different people, they, even though they all work on the brain, they're used to seeing data in very different kinds of ways. So if you're a cognitive psychologist, you're used to seeing fMRI scans. Those look a particular way. If you're a neurophysiologist, you expect to see something like spikes. Those look a different way. And so when you're building models, you really want to be able to visualize essentially the same information, but in all the different kinds of ways that the different areas of neuroscience are used to, right? And I think the other interesting aspect about visualization is that for us, it's not only on the output side. Because if you're building something which is supposed to be running on 1,000 cores or 1,000,000 neurons, you can't show every single neuron and every single connection in your model when you're constructing it. So even before you get any data, you have to come up with methods for trying to collapse the visualization of the model itself, what you're building. And that presents some very interesting design challenges when it comes to trying to come up with graphical user interfaces, ways that people can interact with that model, trying to debug a model which has 2 million neurons in it and hundreds of thousands or almost actually trillions of connections. So both on the development side and on the visualization side, I think you have to be very sensitive to respond to the needs of the user effectively.
Michael, you're nodding. Do you want to jump in here on the visualization question?
Yeah, it's a huge question which comes up with presenting data to clinicians. We need to be able to show them the most relevant portion of the data on the fly, and also we need to be able to highlight for example, when we visualize similarity between two patients, why we think that these two patients are similar. So for example, they may both have a nervous system phenotype and a cardiac phenotype, and figuring out how to present such very, very high dimensional data logically using, basically we use circle-like representations where different parts of the body are mapped onto different sectors of a circle. There's really a lot of opportunity to develop these data visualization components, but also user interface components for clinicians. It really required different ways of thinking.
Thank you. Andrew, any comments on visualization?
Most of the stuff that we're doing right now is still at a fairly small scale. So like I was saying, with even 250 qubits, you end up with trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of options. And I think a lot of the times, the best visualizations are the ones that leave what's actually happening under the hood and just sort of present clear outcomes. So I think a lot of what we've learned is that actually presenting, I'm interested in showing look how cool all the stuff that we're doing is, but really what people sometimes want is less information. They just want the course of action. And so what we've tried to do is to try and make quantum computing as boring as possible in a way. I think I succeeded today, but to try and really make it so that it's just basically a decision engine that allows you to get to where you want to go.
Any comments on visualization?
If your goal is to really frighten a lawyer, you should show them lots of pictures and graphs and numbers. So actually, a lawyer's stock and trade are letters and words, and that's what we intend to stick with.
So this is really a principle of the visualization world, which is you try and really adopt visualizations to the culture you're working with. You try and personalize. We're going to go out to the audience, and I hope that you have some questions to ask these very, very smart four panelists. Before we do that, I just want to say that they're really great evidence of how there still is the human in the loop of big data. And some of what's so exciting about these technologies is they push the boundaries of where the interface between computation and human intelligence lies. And we really need this kind of incredible research and commercialization capacity to really open up that world for us. So I'm sure there's some questions. Don't be daunted by how smart they are. You are too.
Thank you
Can you
very much.
identify yourself too?
Sure,
Yes?
I will. James from Seneca College. Thank you for the panel. I've done a lot of research with clinicians, and I play golf with lawyers. So I think my question could be for either of you around trusting the technology that's going to be hopefully enabling them. And so the little bit of advice, I don't play with tax lawyers, but I play with the litigators. And I've never met a clinician or a lawyer who doesn't like being right. So maybe what you need to do is think about how to build their trust so that they know your tools will not just make them better, but will make them more right. Have you thought about that?
Ben, I think that was a bit
Sure.
for you.
James, that's a great question. So one of the things that we intend to do is, as we kind of map out the decision space for different questions, different legal questions, is to track cases as they're decided, right? And keep track of our prediction accuracy going forward. And one of the nice things suggested by your question is, wouldn't it be nice to ask a selected kind of panel of litigators, for example, to predict the outcome of the forthcoming set of cases in a particular area, and then kind of report on their accuracy, like wait and see what happens in the next 6 months, identify the outcomes in those cases, and then compare it to what the predictions are of our tool. And my prediction is that we would outperform them, but I think those professionals with the tool would be better than either alone. So that's a great idea. Thanks for that suggestion.
Any other comments on this?
Yeah,
Michael?
so I actually think it's not about a matter of the clinician being right. It's about a matter of the clinician actually finding the right diagnosis, whichever way the clinician achieves at it. And at the end of the day, most clinicians I talk to, they want to find the best answer for their patient. And sometimes this means the clinician is right on day one, and sometimes it means the clinician actually has to be guided to the right answer. And they sometimes order tests that are unnecessary, but as a result of that, they eventually identify the true cause. So I think they're quite willing to work with the software to have the software help them be right.
Great, thanks. Next question.
Hello, I'm a student at U of T. I'm studying AI, and I'm president of the AI group there. And this is primarily addressed for Dr. Elias Smith, and I'll have another question after. But you addressed something really interesting, I think, inducing mental states in artificial brains as a way of, conducting neuroscience and conducting medicine. Do you have any ethical concerns pertaining to potentially implementing conscious or, of some level of consciousness systems and then inducing states of pain, torture, et cetera, et cetera? I understand, I believe the benefits are immense, but are there any ethical constraints that you have to entertain?
So actually, this question was addressed fairly directly yesterday by Neil's talk that he gave at the Discovery Theater. And I think clearly at this point the answer is no. This model is far too simple to be concerned about these sorts of things. We're not modeling any of the sort of pain areas. It doesn't really have any particular goals that we could be thwarting in some particular way. But this is a question that comes up a lot. And I think, we really do, in philosophy, have a lot of methods for understanding how to deal ethically with agents which aren't human, right? And I think that that's the appropriate place to start looking when we're trying to think about how do you deal with agents which aren't human, right, or biological. And because a lot of the kinds of, considerations that people bring to bear are really general considerations. They don't depend on whether or not it's a biological agent or a non-biological agent. But yeah, you definitely want to keep that sort of thing in mind. Exactly how far we are away from, when we need to start thinking about that, it's not entirely clear. But I think, signing on to the kinds of letters and promises that Neil has is a good way to at least keep ourselves conscious of the fact that, this is something that we need to think about.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Kurt. I'm from the University of Windsor, and I'm entering my 4th year. And I just wanted to ask a question about the marriage between post-grad work as well as a startup as well. As it is something I'm personally experiencing right now, and I'd like to hear, a comment as in, what's the most amount of resistance that you have of marrying those two, and also, one of the greatest benefits of it.
Yeah, Andrew.
I'm happy to talk about that. We have a lot of postdocs and graduate students. Most of the people who started at 1Qubit started as they were finishing up their PhDs and have come on either as postdoc researchers or just employees. And I suppose it's probably very different for a company where there's a very established set of like what's right and wrong. And but for us, we just thought as long as there's going to be this discovery and creation of what the company is and really what the field is, then we don't need people that we need to tell what to do. We need to tell people what our goals are and hire people who are smart enough to figure out how to achieve those goals for themselves. And I feel like that's kind of the common thread from a successful person who's gone through their PhD program is they've learned how to learn, and they've learned how to take that learning and to reduce it down into something meaningful. So for us, it's a very, very natural fit, and I think that we'll continue bringing on, even once we have kind of an established dogma of how to do things internally at 1Qubit, we'll still be looking to bring in new people and to challenge us with their ideas, and I think it's a very natural fit. I'm actually surprised that there isn't more of that occurring sort of generally within the real world, as they say. But I think it's probably also because it's not really assumed that a lot of people come, do a degree like yours and come out looking to dive into, a lot of stuff that's, the real world of business. And so I think a lot of people don't think that it's that attractive. So there's maybe just not the actual putting together of those parties. But I think when it happens, there's a lot of great things that come from it.
Great, thank you. Next question.
Hi, it's Vijay Kadadi. My background is in philosophy, so I did a PhD in philosophy before turning to entrepreneurship and venture strategy. So I was very interested in what you were saying specifically, Andrew, about the quantum computers utilizing non-classical logic or moving away from that classical world. And the question I have is, okay, in the classical context, you have a very simple logic, but when you move to non-classical, you have a huge variety of different logics that you can apply. So, paraconsistent logics and so on and so forth. Now, the choice of which of those non-classical logics you are going to use, is that something that falls within the scope of what you're doing, or is that something that's part of the hardware setup? Or is that something that a software could innovate, basically? Yeah.
Great question. Andrew.
When you have a new piece of hardware, a lot of it's just trying to determine what you really can and can't do with it, taking the theories and being able to actually test them in the physical world. A lot of what we're building right now are some of what we think of as the low-hanging fruit. So being able to use this combinatorial optimization very directly to solve combinatorial optimization problems. The more interesting stuff comes when you start thinking about using machine learning techniques and thinking about things like restricted Boltzmann machines, being able to put together systems that maybe don't do logic the way that we think of them, like logic gates and things that run traditional hardware systems, but you can actually utilize some of these machines in order to build up things like traditional logic systems, and you do have the ability to choose what you'd like to do, and you have the ability to do things like to run those systems in reverse and things that aren't possible with classical machines. So there is a lot of thought that goes into that. We actually have one of our postdocs is currently writing a paper in conjunction with a number of leading universities trying to characterize some of those very features. But the interesting thing is, logic is already a very well-defined system of philosophy and mathematics. being able to see how you can instantiate those particular forms of logic in the physical hardware or in the software that runs on top of it, that is really a part of what we get to do, and it's an exciting part of it.
And you might want to talk to Chris afterwards too, because he has a philosopher on his team and he is also a philosopher. But I'm going to try and get to the next two questions before we end the session. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Michele Mosca. I'm a co-founder of the Institute for Quantum Computing at the University of Waterloo. So, Canada, Ontario, we're world leaders in the research, we're world leaders in the innovation side of things. From your experience, what's the main one or two bottlenecks to us being global leaders in the commercialization of these innovations, so we can reap, the prosperity from these innovations?
Okay, 20-second sound bites from each of you. Chris, do you want to start? 30 seconds.
I think the question was geared towards quantum computation in particular. Oh, this is like a general question. I'm sorry, yeah. Maybe just because I associate you with quantum computing. So yeah, I think that one of the things that happens to you immediately as soon as you start talking to financiers and so on is you run into people who are willing to take much higher risks and have a lot deeper pockets south of the border than you do in Canada. And it's one of those things which is unfortunate, but it's also undeniable. So as soon as you begin to spend time in Silicon Valley, so one of the teams we're working with is from Stanford, so we're there all the time, and we spoke to some investors, potential investors and so on, and they just have a very different attitude towards the kinds of risks that they're willing to tolerate. And I'm not sure what the kind of thing is that we can do to change that in Canada exactly, but it's something that I think drives a lot of companies down south.
Michael.
I'm going to be controversial. So I did my PhD at Stanford and was involved with, saw all these companies being formed around me as I was doing my PhD. And I think it's the fact that they actually work harder down south of the border. It's both a good thing and a bad thing. We can enjoy a bit more of our life, but they spend more hours, I think, on average, not every individual person, but on average working. So if that's a trade-off that some people are willing to make and others are not.
Do more hours invested mean more productivity? That's a whole other conversation. Andrew,
question.
Over to you.
Absolutely. There's a lot of, especially in quantum computing, there's a lot of conversation back and forth about what should be pursued and what's actually ready to be commercialized. And I feel like one of the things that's really cool about the Silicon Valley ecosystem is there's kind of just this, throw it at the wall, see what sticks, then rework it, try it again. And you do find people who have the appetite for that down there. We found it was actually very easy to find seed funding up here. So people who said, this might be a little bit out there for what we normally invest in, but I'm interested in seeing that be produced, and I want to back that and have it come into the world. Where the real bottleneck, in my opinion, is in Canada is at some of the intermediate stages. There's tons of financing for big companies that need to get even bigger or grow an IPO. There's lots of financing to kind of get started. But once you use that seed funding in order to build something really interesting, but you're at the point where it's ready to be deployed, not ready to just start raking in cash, that's the stage where I feel like the United States and the investors in the States have really come in to fill that gap. And it's unfortunate because it does mean that we end up losing a lot of talent down to the States at that point.
Ben.
I think from my perspective, one of the challenges that we face is the legal profession is a very conservative profession. And I think that's probably true everywhere. And so my main challenge is isolating and finding those lawyers who are more entrepreneurial and willing to take a shot on something like this.
So you have 10 seconds to make a last comment, not a question.
I'll wait till I start. That's okay. Thank you all very much for coming.
Well done, thanks. Maybe you can grab the panelists afterwards. I'm going to turn things back to Ron in a moment. I just wanted to, again, do a little bit of self-promotion. Please come to the CIV DDD booth and check it out before OCE Discovery ends. And if you really want an adventure, OCAD University is having its 100th GradX opening tomorrow night. And you can see the most amazing art and design work that will show you all about the future. 100 McCall. Ron, back to you, but can we have a hand for our panel? They did a wonderful job.